For the nation, they're midterms. For some Arkansas politicians, will they be simply mid-tenures? Can once dominant Democrats regain their footing at the local and district level? The incumbent president, he retains his job performance rating in Arkansas, but is that an asset in every precinct? But first, with spirited early voting ahead of Tuesday's showdown, what do we know about the Arkansas political mindset? Arkansas Week, next.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll bring on the panel in just a moment. At this moment, however, we take note of an anniversary, the 20th annual Arkansas poll, a product of the Political Science Department at the University of Arkansas's Fulbright College. Poll is not so much a predictor of campaigns and outcomes as an assessment of the Arkansas electorate, where it stands, how it leans. And what better time than now, only days before regular balloting begins. Joining us now from Fayetteville is the Arkansas Polls Director, Dr. Janine Perry. Janine, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's go to the numbers first in the big race, I suppose, and that's the gubernatorial contest. And your numbers suggest, sample by the way, of about 1,200, a fairly substantial lead for the incumbent.
Yeah, I don't think it'll come as a surprise to most of your viewers to learn that in our statewide sample of 800, and then we had a subsample and oversample in Northwest Arkansas, but in that statewide sample, we've got a double-digit lead for the Republican incumbent.
What's looking back over 20, measuring this year against the past 20? What are the components, the elements that really leap out at you?
One of the things that I'm actually somewhat comforted by is the consistency in a lot of the issue areas and in a lot of the demographic battery, the questions we collect about education and income, church attendance, that kind of thing. Because consistency year over year as a general rule tells me I'm not getting noise, but that this actually is a random sample of the way Arkansans feel. And of course, our number one goal is to try to help policymakers translate that into public policy statewide. So usually it's the consistency, the uninteresting, the no surprises that I appreciate most about the poll in a given year.
Well, where is Arkansas now? How conservative is conservative? How red is red?
I think that's a great question, and one we've all been discussing certainly for the last several election cycles. Essentially, there was a shift in the electorate that started pretty clearly in 2010. Prior to that time, in the years going back to 1999, when we started recording this, when we asked people in our sample, generally speaking, do you consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, or something else, we would get about 25% Republican, 35% Democrat, 35 to 40% independents. But in 2010, things started to shift, and not perhaps in the way you'd think in that first question, but rather in the second question, which is where we follow up with the independents who really make or break statewide elections in Arkansas and ask them which way they lean. And until 2010, it would break out into roughly a third lean Republican, a third lean Democrat, and a third insisted they were squarely independents. In 2010, those independents took a hard right shift. We've seen people pull back from that a little bit, and a little bit of an uptick actually in the Democratic leaners. But as a general rule, where we stand right now is an electorate that's more Republican than it ever has been at first blush, and then also where those independents are leaning to the right.
Yeah. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, on the other hand, one of the puzzles this year, and it bounces around, this happens sometimes in election years when we have people's attention. We also have some mixed signals and the policy preferences. They don't necessarily line up with what we would expect from a strictly red state. And I'll give you two examples. One is that we ask about general abortion regulation most years. And in this year, we have the lowest percentage of people saying they want stricter abortion regulation than we've had in a 20-year period. So an increasingly Republican state wanting increasingly less restrictions on abortion. Similarly, we have the highest percentage that we have recorded since 1999, and there are subtle differences, but they're outside the margin of error, saying they want greater gun regulation. So again, a Republican-leaning state, and consistently so since 2010, and yet wanting to see more gun regulation, which isn't exactly in keeping with the party's platform or activities. So I think that's an interesting puzzle for folks to sort out.
Well, it may be, though, in keeping with recent headlines, sad to say, but some of the other hot button issues seem to be notably less hot. Same-sex marriage, gender identity, sexual orientation, even global warming seem to be not quite the third rail that maybe perhaps we envisioned.
Right. I mean, you think back to 2004 and some of the things that we were asked to vote on statewide and how that may have influenced some election outcomes during those years. We're now 10 or 15 years away from that. And essentially what Arkansas opinion is doing on gay and lesbian issues and sort of the full menu of civil rights protections is doing what the rest of the country started doing, 10 or even 15 years ago. We now have fully half of the sample saying they support marriage equality. And of course, that's after the Supreme Court decision that made that law. We'd seen a gradual uptick, but we saw a really big increase in that number this year. And we have more than half of the people saying same-sex access to adoption policy. And then if you move into the workplace, into housing, things of that nature, Arkansans, like the rest of the country, are now at 90% support for the full gamut of equal rights. So used to be so contentious and no longer appears to be.
Well, let me throw this word out, immigration. What did you find?
It's interesting. Immigration, it typically does not register as one of the top issues or pressing problems that people are thinking about when we call. That's always our gateway question every year. What is the most pressing problem or issue in Arkansas today? And it could be because people don't think of it as a state issue. But generally speaking, when you look at the policy matters they mention, I'm not sure that's a great explanation. But traditionally, it's been the bread and butter issues, which are healthcare, education, and the economy. And that's, again, what we see this year. So we didn't do much on immigration this year. I know it's been on the public agenda in a particularly strong way in the last week or so. But when we entered the field, it just wasn't what we led with. So other than the fact that it does not appear and hasn't really most years as a pressing issue or problem, we don't have much to go on this year with respect to immigration.
Well, centrism and moderation were forever. The catchphrase is the mainstay, it was believed, of successful politics in Arkansas. What do we draw from these numbers? Is that still valid, or are we still pretty hard to starboard?
Oh, I actually think it's still centrist for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. When you look at some of the still hot button topics like abortion or gun regulation, you see that there's a mixed bag out there in a representative sample of the electorate, and really this is a likely voter sample is the way that it works out. But that's not necessarily what we see reflected in the legislature. That's probably not an Arkansas thing, that's a national political climate thing. But I think it's worth trying to translate public opinion into public policy, and I would just urge policymakers and reporters and citizens to take a look at our annual effort to do this. We've now interviewed 17,000 people across the 20 years, and typically we ask between 50 and 60 questions. So if you want to know what Arkansans want, this is a more regular and a fuller way to do that than say just the regular election outcomes.
Dr. Janine Perry at the University of Arkansas with the Arkansas poll. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back. Hello, we are back now with our political panel. Jessica Deloach-Sabin joins us, also John Burris. A couple of political pros, the left and the right of it will sort itself out pretty quickly. We'll start anyway, John, we'll start with you, and we'll call up the numbers again from the Arkansas poll. It's the latest survey and probably the last, maybe the last that we'll see before regular voting begins. And as Janine Perry mentioned, pretty significant lead for Governor Hutchinson. No big surprise there.
It's not. You know, it's the end of the campaign, so you want to say good things. You know, Jared Henderson had a tough race from the start that didn't keep him from getting in, but given Asa's pretty practical record, accomplishments, cutting taxes, delivering on things like computer coding in schools, all the things he ran on the first time, it's not surprising that he is where he is, especially given the layout of Republican Party popularity in the state. But it's been a pretty good campaign for both of them. I think the governor deserves re-election, and that's reflected in the poll.
Yeah, Jessica, you could almost say he's surfing a red tide.
He is. He definitely is. I mean, I think that this particular race has been incredibly civil considering everything that's at stake. You know, the Arkansas poll it had a lot of encouraging results, because what you see is that despite how wacky things seem to be nationally, here in Arkansas, things seem to be relatively calm. You know, all across the board, you saw not as many surprises, but you saw a lot of positive data that reflects that Arkansas has a more moderate perspective on very controversial issues. And that has only increased, and I think that that's a really bright spot considering how, like I said, how wacky things have been across the country.
Yeah, well, to that point, you know, we've got some results here which we'll illustrate again. And again, Dr. Perry and I were talking about it a little bit earlier in the program, but you look at, for example, gun control. Those who are, and you have to factor in too some pretty sad recent events, but those who believe in stricter gun control in Arkansas, that figure is up. Those who would have stricter control, 44%, that's up about 7 points. That's a little bit outside the margin of error from only last year. For those who think that abortion laws should be more difficult, take a look at that one. That is down almost 8 or 9 points from last year. And again, similar results on same-sex marriage too. The acceptance of that seems to be growing. So what, John Burris, do you read from that? Guess we're getting used to it, or?
Probably. I'm not a political scientist or a pollster. I think it is that we're getting used to it. I think the intensity of the debates, I mean, you can't read social media without people giving an opinion. Probably demography changes. I mean, yeah, my generation, Jessica's generation, are probably a little bit different on those issues, generally speaking. You know, I think it boils down, it's kind of like Congress. You know, Congress has a very low approval rating. Everybody loves their congressman, or most people do. And same thing with gun control. You might click yes, I'm for more gun control. What does that mean? You don't know, and you can't say. And if someone actually passed something, it might be individually unpopular, but on the surface, it feels like that's the popular thing to say these days, so people say it, or more people say it, and I think that's a big part of it too.
Yeah, the generic tends to fade, or can anyway, when the rubber meets the road anyway. Jessica?
But what this shows you, though, is that there is an appeal to humanity that I think is finally starting to break free from partisan restraints. So you have had so many tragic events when you're just speaking about gun control, and we've seen one tragedy after another in this country, a lot of those tragedies that could have been prevented. But what we also know is that there's messaging surrounding the reality of gun control laws in this country. And we know how many women have been victims of domestic violence, and how many of those women lost their lives because a person was able to get their hands on a gun when they had a record of being abusive. That's a law that could be addressed. And I think that what John was saying, there's a lot of nuance within these numbers. What exactly what does that support mean? That's a key place that you can point to. There are people who say, wait a second, we're not even doing the bare minimum to address this issue. Come on, let's do better. When it comes to reproductive rights and a woman's ability to govern over her own body, I think there are a lot of people who have become accepting of Roe versus Wade and what the law of the land is, and understanding that women do need to be empowered to make decisions for what's best for their general autonomy, for their bodies, for their families, so on and so forth. And then also with LGBTQ rights, you have a lot of hatred that is circulating through this country that's focused on very specific groups of people. That group of people is certainly one of those groups, and people have had enough. This is about being a human, and it's about doing right by your fellow man.
John, is it still, no matter if the hot button issues are a little cooler than they were, does that mean what? The economy? Numbers have been fantastic. The deficit numbers are going too, and of course the Fed's likely to kick rates again in December, but the data look pretty good.
Economy numbers, fantastic. Healthcare, I think depending on which poll you look at, still the #1 driver. And we'll talk about the 2nd district race here in a little bit. It played a little bit of a factor there, probably not as much as it should have, because healthcare is just top of mind for people right now, as is the economy. The social issues fade. I mean, Jessica made some fair points, especially around, there's a lot of chatter in Arkansas around like a red flag law with guns and domestic abuse. There's some common ground. There's more common ground on some issues there than maybe there have been in the past. And I think you'll see the legislature make some progress there. I don't think people are shying away from those debates. But what's top of mind for people, it is economy and healthcare.
Yeah, let's take a look at the 2nd district since you brought it up, and the Democrats had put a lot of emotional capital, Jessica, into that 2nd district race.
They certainly have. Well, Representative Clark Tucker has had his own.
And a little real capital too. I mean, both.
Sure. Yeah. No, this race has been one of the most significant races in this cycle here in Arkansas. Representative Tucker, he knew the race he was getting into. He knew the difficulty that would be there, and he's run a very solid campaign. He put forth things that he has personally experienced, which definitely relates to healthcare. He's had his own challenges in the past that he has been able to overcome, and he's put himself forward to say, I'm now a person who has a pre-existing condition. I want to be sent to Congress to protect you and any changes that could be made in your insurance when it comes to pre-existing conditions. I mean, he has made it a point to show people that he is going to be there to work for them, but he's doing so against a candidate who also has high approval ratings within that same district.
Did it surprise you at all that Mr. Tucker did not get into Mr. Hill's face more than he did?
If you know Clark, you know him to be a very level-headed, logical, pragmatic, reasonable person. He wanted to run a clean campaign. His entire objective was to say, I want to present you with an option that I think is better. He is not a person who's combative. He has received criticism for not being a bit more bombastic and going after his opponent. Some people would tell him to his face that you should have done that. But if that's not who a person is, that's not what they're going to do. And honestly, if you're running a campaign saying, I want to restore some sort of sanity to Congress, you need to run that same way too, and that's what he's chosen to do.
No.
I mostly agree with a lot of that. I mean, there's just nothing worse than this part of the campaign where everyone can tell you what you did wrong. Victory has 1,000 fathers, defeat is an orphan, and so.
Well, let's count the votes too.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's right. I mean, I think it's going to be a tight race. I think Clark Tucker is probably about as good of a candidate as the Democrats could put up. The reality of it is, French Hill is just a pretty popular incumbent. He's actually pretty moderate and a pretty nice guy on some issues at least, no matter what Democrats want to act like in election year, and he does a pretty good job. That just means at the end of the day it was going to be a tough race, and I think he'll win. I think all that said, what Jessica said about Clark being a little bit more aggressive, I think he probably could have been. There's nothing wrong, very generally speaking, with contrast. I mean, when you're running for office, you're running because you think you can do a better job than the other guy, and it's okay to say that. And sometimes people are just personality disposed to not because they let the chatter in class get in their ear about what they think they're supposed to do. And so I don't know if that's what happened here and if that took a toll and if Clark had a better strategy, if that would have given him better odds of success. I think depending on turnout in Little Rock and things like that, it could very well be closer than people are thinking right now. Right now the polls show French Hill about 10 points up. If that sticks, I think that's where it is.
Overall, will the balance of power, if you want to call it that, in Arkansas have shifted at all come January?
I say not at all.
In terms of legislative, state, local, county offices, everything.
Republicans might pick up some county stuff. To be honest, I haven't looked. I assume there's probably more Republicans running on a county level, and just over time we pick up more of those seats. Legislatively, Republicans think they're going to add a few. I think there's just generally speaking, it's going to be the same. There's some individual races depending in some suburban areas that may or may not, Republicans may or may not win, but I think generally the numbers will be the same.
Yes.
John's right. There isn't going to be a significant shift in terms of the balance of power throughout the state. This is just not the year for that. If you want to go back to the Arkansas poll, you will see where President Trump's approval ratings rest. You will see where the approval ratings of all of our major Republican leaders rest. So it's probably safe to say that there will not be a tremendous jump or imbalance in that power. And that's okay, because I think what's important is that you have a Democratic Party system that is being rebuilt here slowly but surely, and a focus on how you do rebuild thoughtfully to a majority. It's going to take some time.
All right. How much time?
Well,
How big is the Trump effect?
I think the Trump
Or
effect.
is it Mr. Trump, or are we just profoundly conservative and are just now coming to grips with that?
I think a lot of people like to pretend like that within Arkansas politics is very local, but it is wrong to say that national messaging does not have an effect on Arkansas. And because of that, I would say until the Democratic Party has a real leader emerge who can definitely solidify what the Democratic brand is in a way that's identifiable to all voters, or at least to the Democratic base even, it's going to be a while until that rebuilding occurs. What Donald Trump says and does has an effect on Arkansas. He has an effect on states all across this country, and he knows it, and the Republican Party knows it, because if they weren't so certain of it, you'd see a lot of Republicans push back on what comes out of his mouth or what shows up on Twitter.
Well, John?
I think that look, I'm not the biggest fan of the president at all. I think the reality is, though, Democrats want to pawn off what's happened in Arkansas to whether it started with Barack Obama, now Donald Trump. I think the reality is just the National Party dictates the agenda, and the National Party's ideology is very different from the normal Arkansas voter. One of my pets has been over the years how quickly Democrats started talking badly about voters when those voters voted against them. But you know, the people that are electing Tom Cotton are the same voters that, for the most part, elected Mike Beebe. What gives? I don't think it's because voters are stupid or racist or petty. I think it's because the National Party of the Democrats sets the tune, and the tune's just out of step here. And that's going to stick for a long time.
And I want to add to that, I think that it is always a misstep when you are critical of voters. You'll hear this talking point all the time. Oh, these voters vote against their own interest all the time. Most voters, when they go to the polls, they're voting from a very personal place. They vote based on what they know about their paycheck, what they know about the challenges that their families face or what they face individually. So it is a misstep.
Vote from the gut.
They do. They always do. And that is something that you always have to rely upon. Because when you're out campaigning, you try to reach people personally. You try to reach them where they are. National messaging has a very toxic effect on your electorate, but also too, I think there's something to be said for the power and influence of political parties themselves. I think that's shifting. I think special interests play a very, very large role in the way politics is conducted in this country, and I think that that effect is going to continue to grow over time, especially with all of the changes we've seen over the last decade with campaign finance reform laws.
A couple of loose ends, if you want to style them as that. John, are we going to have casinos in a few months?
I think so. Just too much money supporting it to stop it, if I had to bet. That's a pun. Right.
Jess?
It is very likely that we do have that.
Minimum wage.
Passes.
It's a populous state above all else, so it passes.
A voter ID.
Same reason it passes.
Passes.
And it just makes sense.
All right. We got to end it there because we're out of time. Jessica,
Thank
John,
you.
thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks.
We'll see you next week.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.